Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, sponsored by EarthX, the world's largest environmental experience, and also sponsored by Natural Awakenings magazine. Live your healthiest life on a healthier planet. Now here's your host, Bernice Butler.
Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today. We are now nearing the end of our third season, but we remain just as excited as ever to help you explore and understand that unbreakable relationship between your health and the health of the planet. Here we look at the hottest topics related to our environment and its sustainability and how they affect your health and wellness. Here, issues like climate change, plastic pollution, extreme weather events, and others will meet up with everyday impacts like allergies and asthma, digestive issues and gut health, cancers, lung and heart issues, and more. So listen today as we interview experts for today's show in our continuing series on air quality and transportation. And today we're going to focus in on the chronic disease toll of air pollution. Now, air pollution is a familiar environmental health hazard. We all know that what we're looking at when brown haze settles over a city, when exhaust just billows across a busy highway, or a plume rises from a smokestack, or a plume comes out of the car in front of you. But some air pollution is not seen, but its pungent smell alerts you. It's a major threat to global health and global prosperity. Air pollution in all its forms is responsible for more than 7 million deaths each year globally. And that's a number that has increased over the past 2 decades. Now, air pollution is the contamination of the indoor or the outdoor environment by any chemical, physical, or biological agent that changes the natural qualities or traits of the air or the atmosphere. And there are many pollutants of major public health concern, both outdoor and indoor air pollution, that cause respiratory and other diseases that are important sources of disease and death as well. Now, the World Health Organization, their data shows that almost all of the global population, or about 99% of the global population, breathes air that exceeds the World Health Organization's guidelines and limits and contains high level of pollutants, with the low and the middle income countries suffering from the highest exposure. So what technically is air pollution? Air pollution is a mix of hazardous substances, both human-made and natural sources. And that's things such as vehicle emissions, fuel oils, and natural gas to heat homes. It's byproducts of manufacturing and power generation, particularly power generated from coal fuel power plants, and films from chemical production are the primary sources of human or man-made pollution. Now, nature also releases hazardous substances into the air, such as smoke from wildfires, which are often caused by people. It also releases ash and gases from volcanic eruption, and gases like methane, which are formed and emitted from decomposing organic matter in soils. Now, you also have the traffic-related air pollution. Then you have ozone, which is an atmospheric gas, and it's often called smog when we see it at ground level. There's noxious gases, which include carbon dioxide and other gases, and they're components of motor vehicle emissions and byproducts as well of industrial processes. Then there's particulate matter, which we'll talk a lot about today, which seems to be getting smaller and smaller and more dangerous. Then you've got the VOCs, or the volatile organic compounds. And these vaporize at or near room temperatures, and they're given off by such things as paints, cleaning supplies, pesticides, some furnishings even, and even craft materials such as glue. Now, air pollution and climate change affect each other, though, through complex interactions in our atmosphere. Air sources, such as emissions from burning fossil fuels, and both are threats to people's health and the environment worldwide. Now, the health effects of air pollution, again, remain a public concern all over the world. Exposure to air pollution has many substantial adverse effects on human health. And as research continues, we're finding more and more effects. I don't know if we're really finding them, but we are discovering them by way of our increases in our scientific knowledge. And the 7 million deaths from air pollution globally are attributable to the joint effects of household as well as ambient or outdoor air pollution. People with chronic respiratory diseases such as chronic obstructive pulmonary disease or COPD and asthma, as well as allergies, are especially vulnerable to the detrimental effects of air pollutants. But increasingly, we're finding more and more health impacts way beyond these usual few that many of us know about. The health effects of air pollution depend on the components as well as the sources of pollutants, which vary with countries, seasons, and times. However, combustion of solid fuels is a major source of air pollutants in developing countries. And while it's a tough problem that's confronted by both developed and developing countries, compared with most developed countries like the U.S. and the European nations that had accomplished their industrialization years back, our developing countries are confronting more severe air pollution due to intense energy consumption, due to large-scale demolition and reconstructions, and increased emissions from transportation in their processes of industrialization and urbanization. According, again, to the World Health Organization, more than 2 million premature deaths each year are related to air pollution. And air pollution has impact on most of the organs and systems of our human body. Air pollutants can induce and aggravate some common diseases and even has adverse effects on the nervous system, digestive system, and the urinary system. Our struggle against air pollution seems to be a long-term task for almost all countries, especially China, which has been in the news lately, and we hear and read a lot about it constantly. However, as we can ourselves surmise, and as researchers have shown, absolutely no level of pollutants in our air is deemed safe. Now, this is a lot, but here today to help us understand this some more and unpack this are two experts that we're very excited to talk about. With us today are Adair Rohani. Heather is with the World Health Organization, or the WHO, and Jason Sachs with the EPA. Now, Heather, again, with the World Health Organization, is acting unit head for air quality and health and the technical lead on energy and health. Heather leads the work on energy and health at the WHO headquarters in Switzerland, and she has led the establishment of the Health and Energy Platform of Action and the High-Level Coalition on Health and Energy. Heather co-led the coordination and development of the WHO guidelines for indoor air quality, household fuel combustion, and she's currently overseeing the work to support countries in the implementation of these guidelines. Heather also actively participates in and represents the World Health Organization at the UN Energy, Sustainable Energy for All, and the Interagency Expert Group on Sustainable Development Goals Indicators. That's a lot, Heather. Did I get all of that right?
Yes, you did. Thank you very much, Bernice.
And thank you so much for making time to join us. Our other guest is Jason Sachs. Again, Jason is with the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, and Jason is senior epidemiologist in the Center for Public Health and Environmental Assessment in the Office of Research and Development at the U.S. EPA, and he's headquartered in the Raleigh-Durham area. Jason is a science lead on the health effects of particulate matter there and the assessment lead for the 2019 Particulate Matter Integrated Science Assessment. Jason plays key leadership roles in synthesizing and integrating the health effects evidence of air pollution for various national ambient air quality standards reviews. And he is an expert on an area of particular concern to us and growing concern, and that is particulate matter. Jason, welcome. And did I get all of that right?
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
And we are so glad that both of you all could join us. Now, we only have just a minute or two before we go to break. So I'm going to start out with Heather So, Heather, it's often said that most of what we are exposed to in the air is invisible. But of course, there is the stuff that we can see sometimes and smell sometimes. So talk to us a little bit about some of that stuff that we're exposed to every day. What are those that are most assaulting our health? And where do these pollutants come from?
Thanks, Bernice, for this question. So one of the things that we see a lot in the environment and is right visible for us that impacts our health a lot is actually soot. We see this kind of black carbon, as you mentioned, you alluded to this fine particulate matter, and that's one of the black carbon is one of those, which is part of the soot that we see in the air. We see soot coming off of everything from just our barbecue pits to heating our homes from power generation, from transport. It's coming off everywhere, and that is something that we're breathing in. And as you can imagine, breathing in this stuff coats your lungs, crosses the barrier, the interstitial tissues, and it impacts your body systemically, really impacting and putting these pollutants all through your body. And this stuff, for example, soot is made up of all sorts of nasty things, all sorts of different chemicals, even viruses can even attach on this soot. So this soot transfers, and it's very, very small, and it really can go deep, deep, deep into your lungs. So it's a really important pollutant that we can see physically, and that really impacts our
body. I want
to
end on soot, and we'll come back and visit it on the other side of the break. But people need to remember soot also comes out of those beautiful fireplaces sometimes. We're going to go to break now, and we want to give a shout out to our sponsors. That is Natural Awakenings, Dallas Fort Worth Metroplex Magazine, The Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority, for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods markets, natural grocers, central markets, sunflower shops, and many, many other locations, as well as available free for download online at nadallas.com. Check them out. Our other sponsor is North Haven Gardens, serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening and plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, gifts, and more. Check them out at nhg.com. Our other sponsor is Lynn Dental Care, practicing dentistry for over 38 years with a holistic approach, none mercury, looking at the whole body. Specializing in periodontics, Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology. Check them out at lindentalcare.com. And our other sponsor is the Weston A. Price Foundation, where ancestral wisdom meets modern science on food farming and the healing arts. The Weston A. Price Foundation is a nutrition foundation teaching people about healthy foods of the past and how you can incorporate those into your life. They educate people about why grass-based and other foods are better quality and help them find these foods. Their new 50% Pledge campaign encourages people to purchase 50% of their foods from local farms and artisans. Check them out at westonaprice.org. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, to today's show on the chronic disease toll of air pollution. And we are back with Adair Rohani with the World Health Organization and Jason Sachs with the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. Again, thank you all for joining us today. And when we left off to go to the break, Heather was telling us about soot. And I wanted to remind everybody that is also what is generated when those sometimes romantic fireplaces, or those that are necessary to keep us warm when the power goes out sometimes, that's generated when our fireplaces are on. So Heather, continue, if you would, telling us about some of the nasty stuff that we are exposed to. Again, a lot of it invisible, but a lot of it certainly that we can see and smell.
Sure. So Thanks, Bernice. And again, as I was saying, so there's this thing, particulate matter, which includes this idea of black carbon and soot and things, but it also includes a whole bunch of other things. We have primary pollutants that are initially emitted off of, power generation and efficient power generation from cars, from households, et cetera. And then we have secondary pollutants that actually, once these primary pollutants, they react with stuff in the air to create additional pollutants. So there is these kind of silent killers, one could say, in the air floating around that is derived from various forms of air pollution reacting against amongst each other. In addition to this particulate matter, we have the soot, black carbon, but then you have this more quiet or not visible, which includes sulfates and nitrates and things compounding. And they go, and as I mentioned, they penetrate deep into your lungs. We also have some other air pollutants, for example, like carbon monoxide is one that happens often in homes and is released from natural gas and other things, and can quietly be inhaled and leads to various asthmatic conditions and carbon monoxide poisoning, etc. But there's other things as well, like ozone that occurs that really leads to aggravation of asthma, leads to increased hospital admissions, etc., which is another one of these kinds of invisible air pollutants that we have going along. And there's things, for example, sulfates. These are often coming off, for example, power generation that are into the air, and they actually have this. They have a bit of a funny taste to them as well. So there are a whole bunch of different pollutants in the air, and they all interact different ways, and they interact with our body in different ways, and they interact with our climate in different ways.
So, Heather, which are we perhaps most exposed to?
It's definitely based on where your location is and what are the local sources around, but also not necessarily immediate around, because air pollution actually can travel quite a distances, right? So air pollution may be created in one state in the U.S. that can actually impact the health and well-being of people living in a different state, because it really knows no boundaries. There's no boundaries for air pollution. It goes and comes from different places. We see this a lot, and for example, in air pollution created in one country can actually transfer it to a whole other country and cause a whole spike in air pollution levels and an increase in health almost crisis in these situations. So indeed, it all depends on where you're located, what are the sources around you, what are the sources that are even further away, and how are they transmitted to where you're living. And you also have climatic conditions that can also make a difference. For example, if you're living in a valley, you maybe have more increases in higher levels of various things depending upon the various winds and shifts, et cetera. And if you live by the ocean, for example, you may be exposed less because of the winds coming along. It all just depends on where you live and what are the specific sources around you.
Let me ask you this. This 7 million people that the World Health Organization has estimated that are affected or killed by air pollution, what pollutant is claiming the most of those?
So those numbers are actually mostly derived off fine particulate matter. And that's what I mentioned earlier. That's that pollutant. It's probably the most well-studied pollutant in the epidemiological literature. And it's one that, really actually helps as a proxy pollutant actually for other pollutants, because often the levels of fine particulate matter are often indicators of other pollutants. So it's actually the fine particulate matter that really is one that's probably the most studied and also the one we're probably most commonly exposed to across the world. And it really can have such systemic impacts on your body, because it can really, as I mentioned earlier, those very fine pieces can really penetrate into your body.
Indeed. And we're so happy to have Jason with us, who is a particulate matter expert. So, Jason, tell us a little bit about that. I was going to say particulate matter till a little bit later on, because we're hearing it over and over from the other shows that we've had this month on air quality as well. But for now, just give us, again, an explanation of particulate matter, why it's so important, and why everybody really must care about it, and how we all come into contact with it.
Sure, thanks, Bernice. And I'll just add on to what Heather was explaining. Particulate matter is a mixture of solid and liquid droplets, and they can form by both primary pollution, which is coming right out of a car or an industrial facility, and they can also be formed through secondary reactions through gaseous pollutants that are emitted also through some of those same sources that, through these complex atmospheric reactions, form additional particles. Now, fine particles are particles that are 2.5 microns in diameter and smaller. So to give you a little bit of idea of how that compares to other things, the human hair is estimated to be about 70 micrometers in diameter. So these fine particles are 30 times smaller than the size of a human hair. Because of their small diameter, that when someone breathes them in, they're able to get to the lower levels of the respiratory tract, where they can get into the alveolar region, and some of these very small particles can then translocate into the blood, where they're able to affect other organ systems outside of the lungs. And I raise this point because for a very long time, it was thought that air pollution, and particularly particulate matter, only affected the respiratory system. Some of the initial studies that were looking at extreme events, such as Denora, Pennsylvania in 1948, which was one of the worst U.S. air quality disasters ever, as well as the London fog episode in 1952, we saw evidence of respiratory effects and mortality. But it wasn't really until the early 1990s when we had a couple of seminal cohort studies. And these are studies that followed people for many years. There was the Harvard Six Cities study, which came out of Harvard University, and the American Cancer Society study. And these studies followed people for many years looking at their PM2.5 exposures and whether or not the risk of death increased in this population. And it's at that time that they noticed not only were they seeing evidence of associations between long-term PM2.5 exposure and mortality, but they were seeing evidence of cardiovascular effects. And this was the first time that it was thought that, wow, is it possible that PM2.5 is affecting organ systems outside of the respiratory tract? And as you can imagine, this was extremely controversial, and it led to a lot of reanalyses of these studies to further confirm it. And it really spawned a large PM research program that the EPA funded and many research institutions embarked on to try and understand what are the biological mechanisms by which fine PM could lead to these effects in these other organ systems, which was not even thought to be plausible when we first started seeing evidence of air pollution and health effects.
So what is it? Connect those dots for us about how it gets to the heart, and because like you said, most of us just associate it with lung because we're breathing it in, so it has to be just at the lungs, but we don't have to worry about stuff beyond that.
That's right. And as I mentioned earlier, so the breathing in is really small particles. They're able to make their way into the lower reaches of the respiratory tract, and they're able to translocate out of the lung into the bloodstream where they can then impart other effects. So you can have oxidative stress, you can have systemic inflammation. There's even evidence of perturbations of the autonomic nervous system, which can lead to changes in heart function. And there's all these other effects that we've seen over time through studies. So long-term exposure to PM2.5 can lead to the acceleration of plaque progression in the blood vessels. It can change the way that blood vessels function. It can have all these long-term effects from exposures over many years that can lead to cardiovascular disease development as well as exacerbation. And I think it's a point we should probably touch on is that exposure, when we think about exposure to air pollution, there's two routes that we think of in terms of exposure duration. When we talk about short-term exposure, we're thinking about exposures that occur on a daily basis. You know, I go outside and there's high levels of air pollution. How is that affecting someone? And we tend to think of that as exacerbation of disease. The other is long-term exposure. And when we're thinking about long-term exposure, this is exposure over many months or many years and often leading to development of disease. And so that's where there's a little bit of distinction when we're looking at the literature of science of air pollution and what we're thinking about health.
Long-term, and I want to talk about that some more on and come back and revisit that. Particulate matter is a very, very important issue in terms of the gigantic effect that it has on our health. Yet, it's not, if you go out and ask 10 people you pass on the street, what is particulate matter and why should we care? And I would venture to say that 9.5 of them would say, what? Particulate, what? What is that? I never heard of that. Even if you explain it to them, it probably still wouldn't settle in. But yet I am hearing over and over again, and you all in your work are seeing it. What's the disconnect?
I think generally the disconnect, I think this is one of the biggest challenges, and this is one of the biggest challenges that we face as public health professionals, is really trying to convey this understanding to the individual and have them understand how it impacts their health. And I think a lot of that is the fact that we really need to be speaking a little bit more to the population. Instead of coming in the news articles and stuff, we need our doctors and nurses speaking to those individuals and speaking to patients as they come and asking, like, are you having some heart issues? Are you doing this? Are you exposed to this regularly? Are you exposed to high levels of air pollution? Are you having trouble with asthma? Are these on days when you have high levels of air pollution? So So it's really trying to make the individual more aware of how it's actually impacting them at a personal level and using perhaps the voice of the health sector to communicate them.
And I think that's very important that you said, and we're going to go to break, and that is the health sector. Usually we do have physicians for the environment or something like that on our show, as well as nurses and other healthcare professionals. And we try to get them more and more because I think it makes sense to me that may be either the point of disconnect or the point where we can connect. So we're going to visit this again or continue this on the other side of the break. We'll be right back with Jason Sachs and Heather Adair Rohani. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, to today's show on the chronic disease toll of air pollution. And we are back with Heather Adair Rohani with the World Health Organization coming to us all the way from Switzerland, and Jason Sachs with the Environmental Protection Agency. And they really are making us smarter. Right before the break, we got into what I call a rabbit trail discussion, but yet a good one, about the disconnect of this very, very serious and impactful issue of particulate matter and how people are not aware of it and it's not settling in. And I think we talked about the fact that people are probably more believing of their healthcare professionals. And so that is a big node or a big connection point. When they're there and they're told or they receive their diagnosis of heart disease or lung disease or whatever, it seems like to me that's a good point. Well, I know me personally, I'm going to always ask, so how did I get that? Or where did that come from? Or what can I do about it? And I do ask that about any and everything. If my fingernail is broke, well, where did that come from? I don't know if everybody does that or not. And that's where I would expect to have a conversation or to hear about perhaps air pollution. Are you all seeing or doing anything or seeing your professions or your trade associations do anything in that area? Jason?
Yeah, that's a really great point, and it's something that we've thought about at the EPA a lot. There's a couple examples of training materials that we've developed specifically targeting medical professionals about particle pollution and your patient's health. We also developed one about wildfire smoke and your patient's health, because it should be something that's at the forefront of the medical profession as they're treating their patients, because we recognize that all diseases are multi-etiologic, and yes, air pollution is contributing in some fashion to some of these disease development. But it's also important when thinking about exacerbation of disease and wanting to keep your patients healthy and making sure that they're taking any actions they can take individually to try and reduce their exposures. But it's definitely something that we've thought about, and we're trying to make inroads in the medical profession to make them recognize that it is a health concern for your patients, and there's information that you can provide them.
Indeed. And of course, that's part of our mission and goal as well here at Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, is to try to help people explore the issues, but also connect the dots. And that's why I keep bringing up things as simple as the soot from the fireplaces, or as one of our experts told us on one of our first shows, anything that combusts or burn is causing air pollution. Now, I want to revisit something that both of you all had mentioned earlier and probably a couple of times, and that is you mentioned secondary pollution. So I'm going to start with you, Heather. I want our listeners to understand what is secondary pollution. How do they know it when they see it or come in contact with it? We know the primary pollutants are the fossil fuels, the stuff coming out of the cars, the smut, the SOG. But tell us more about those secondary pollutants.
Well, secondary pollutants are generally things that, again, as mentioned by Jason, these are chemical reactions that happen basically in the air. They're not something you're necessarily going to physically see or you're going to physically experience, but it's just adding to the air pollutants that are already in the primary pollutants that have been put into the air to add basically to increasing the levels of different pollution and creating new types of pollution too, based on these reactions that happen in the air. So, for example, methane can also react in the air to lead to more ozone, which can lead to more asthma, et cetera. So it depends upon the pollutants, and these things are happening that you may not be able to physically experience yourself, but they're happening and they're increasing your levels of exposure, which is really critical for you to minimize.
So, for example, most of us have heard of ozone because we have most cities have the ozone alerts, and every news broadcast across the country, for the most part, is giving it's a high ozone day or tomorrow's going to be a high ozone day. So, is ozone one of those secondary pollutants? Jason?
Yeah, ozone is a secondary pollutant. It's formed in the atmosphere through complex reactions between oxides of nitrogen and volatile organic chemicals in the presence of sunlight. And so that's why we tend to see higher ozone concentrations in the summer when temperatures are warmer and there's more sun out, because we can have those chemical reactions. And then we also have these secondary reactions with particulate matter, as Heather spoke about earlier. And so I think it's, in the case of PM, we'll differentiate them from, I think, a basic science standpoint of trying to understand what are the processes by which PM forms. But when we think about PM and regulatory actions or guidelines, we don't differentiate where the PM is coming from necessarily, because we've looked at all the studies that have looked at different sources of PM or different chemical composition of PM. And to date, while we see that many sources and components of PM are associated with a variety of health effects, PM 2.5 mass, which is that total amount of PM in the ambient air, is still the best indicator of relationships with health that we have.
The smokes and wildfires, that's producing particulate matter. Can it start at one size and get smaller and smaller and smaller? Just talk to us a little bit about these different sizes.
Sure, that's a really great question. And often when I give presentations, I try to make people understand that the particulate matter is a distribution of particles. So when you hear people talk about PM 2.5 or PM 10 or other size fractions, it's important to remember that not all the particles are 10 micrometers in diameter or 2.5 micrometers in diameter, but there's a distribution of particles. You have some that are really small that are being defined as PM 2.5. And so when you have particles being emitted from a source, you do have some particles that are smaller, and they tend to be referred to as ultrafine particles. So they're particles that are often 0.1 micrometer in diameter and smaller. So that's really small. But these particles don't stay in that size range very long. They often, within the span of about 200 meters from where they're generated, they start grouping together and increasing in size, and eventually will be larger than the ultrafine range. And so we don't know a lot about the health effects of these really small particles because they're hard to measure. In the United States, we don't have a monitoring network in place to measure ultrafine particles. In Europe, they have more ultrafine particle monitors around. But we know that they vary very much spatially and temporally, more so than we see for PM 2.5, which is rather spatially homogeneous over an area compared to what we see for these really tiny particles. And then, as you mentioned earlier, with wildfire smoke, wildfire smoke is also a complex mixture of air pollutants. But of those air pollutants, PM 2.5 is one of the biggest contributors to wildfire smoke. And it's often what people talk about when we think about wildfire smoke, because we have decades of research on ambient PM 2.5 exposures, and we know that it's detrimental to health.
About how far does the wildfire smoke travel? For example, we have a lot every year. We have wildfires in California, and a few years ago, when this show first started, we had lots and lots of the wildfires in Australia. How far do those travel? At what point do they affect us here, like in Texas from California?
That's a really great question. And I think it's something that often gets lost a little bit, that people, when they think about wildfires, they think about the environmental impacts and smoke impacts in the vicinity of the fire itself, not recognizing that the smoke is being transported across the country. And so even though you might not visibly see the smoke, we have monitoring folks at EPA that have done studies where they've measured air quality and PM concentrations in Washington, D.C., and they'll see these spikes in PM 2.5 concentrations, and they can't figure out why. And then they have to remember, forgot, there's a large wildfire happening in California right now. So you can get transport across the country, and that's where when the EPA in collaboration with the Forest Service, they developed a fire and smoke map, and that's on airnow.gov. And it's a great resource for people to be able to see not only the fact that smoke is transporting across the country, but also to give them an idea of what's the air quality where I live and what's the impact that it could have on me and what are actions I can take to reduce my exposures.
Indeed. I'm glad to know that, and hopefully we can repeat that site again near the end of the show. Now, the other thing I want to explore that you all have talked about, but we only have about a minute to go before we go to break, and that is long-term and short-term effects. There is just so much to cover as it relates to air pollution that's really important for all of us. So I want to start out with Heather, and I hate to keep doing this to you, Heather, having you start and stop, but talking about, I guess, long-term and short-term effects of air pollution.
Sure, no problem. So indeed, when we say acute or short-term exposures or periods, we're specifically talking around, sometimes we have exposure values for up to 4 hours, but it's normally about the 24-hour kind of period. It's a very short kind of period. When we're talking chronic, we're talking for more longer periods, more like on terms of years. And this is actually where we see the largest disease burden is from this chronic exposure, where you're exposed to it for a very long period of time, and it leads to these chronic diseases like heart disease, the chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, et cetera, because it's your body being exposed to this pollution over and over and over again over the long term that you create you have these issues and create these long-term diseases. So this is actually the exposure that we're probably most worried about to prevent disease, and the disease burden would be this long-term, more chronic exposure.
And I have to think, too, that long-term, there's a lot of stuff we don't know yet. And again, we'll talk about it on the other side. We're going to go to break now. We want to give a shout out to our sponsors. That is Natural Awakenings, Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex Magazine, The Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods markets, natural grocers, Central Markets, sunflower shops, and many, many other locations, as well as available free for download online at nadallas.com. Check them out. Our other sponsor is North Haven Gardens, serving the Metroplex since 1951. The most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening and plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, gifts, and more. Check them out at nhg.com. Our other sponsor is Lynn Dental Care, practicing dentistry for over 38 years with a holistic approach, non-mercury, looking at the whole body. Specializing in periodontics, Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and toxicologist. And our other sponsor is the Weston A. Price Foundation, where ancestral wisdom meets modern science on food, farming, and the healing arts. The Weston A. Price Foundation is a nutrition foundation teaching people about healthy foods of the past and how you can incorporate those into your life. The foundation educates people about why grass-based and other foods are better quality and helps them find those foods. With its 50% pledge campaign, the foundation encourages people to purchase 50% of their food from local farms and artisans. Check them out at westonaprice.org. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. To today's show on the chronic disease toll of air pollution. And we are back with Heather Adair Rohani with the World Health Organization and Jason Sachs with the Environmental Protection Agency. And they really are making us smarter about this and some of the things that are going on all around us. Now, I want to talk a little bit more on our last segment, and time always flies when we're having fun, as they say. So I want to talk about, to you, Jason, is there an intersection with air pollution and some of the diseases that seem to be on the rise, such as dementia and Alzheimer's and ADHD, or others that are not commonly associated with the lung-oriented diseases that we all have grown to associate with air pollution?
That's a really great question, Bernice. Over time, as we've further examined air pollution, we've seen more and more health effects associated with different diseases and illnesses. And I think the first thing to keep in mind is that all diseases are multi-etiologic. And so, there's a variety of things that are causing all the diseases that people experience. And air pollution is just one component of some of those insults that we experience that could lead to a disease. But in saying that, there has been a large growth in the amount of studies looking at nervous system effects over the last number of years. And we fully accounted for this and evaluated these studies in the most recent integrated science assessment for particulate matter. Just to give you an idea of what that document is, when we conduct a review of the national ambient air quality standards for each of the criteria of pollutants, of which PM is one, the Clean Air Act says that we have to evaluate the scientific criteria for those pollutants. So we go through hundreds of thousands of studies looking at, for the case of PM, particulate matter, and evaluate those studies and assess the causal nature of the relationships between PM exposure and health. And so what we're trying to say is, how confident are we that exposure to PM, either short-term or long-term exposure, has a causal relationship, means it can cause the diseases that we're interested in. And so in doing that, this last go-around was the first time that we really had a lot of studies looking at long-term PM 2.5 exposure and nervous system effects that allowed to make a conclusion. And so for this time, we saw a lot of evidence from epidemiologic studies that PM 2.5 is associated with reductions in brain volume as well as cognitive decline. And that's the first time we've ever seen that. And so this is, again, focusing on effects in older adults. And we did have some toxicological studies that were supporting what we saw in the epidemiologic studies. So it's providing some evidence of biological plausibility, because that's really important when we're looking at the science. Epidemiology studies are population level studies where all we can say is this exposure associated with the health effect? We can't say, are we really sure that it's causing the effect until we look at experimental studies? So this is animal toxicological studies, or in some cases, controlled human exposure studies that are providing, what are the biological mechanisms by which it's plausible that we could see these effects that we're seeing in the epidemiology studies. And we had some animal toxicological studies that were showing that it's plausible that when you breathe in particles, they can translocate from the olfactory bulb into the brain. And so it was showing a mechanism by which it was possible that PM exposures could lead to some of these nervous system effects that we're seeing in the epidemiology studies.
Heather, is there a connection, or we've seen a connection between air pollution and COVID? And so what is that intersection?
Well, we've definitely seen trends in the increase in COVID cases within very highly polluted areas, of air polluted areas. In addition, we just know also that the exposure to air pollution automatically leads to these background diseases, decreases your immunity, and basically increasing your susceptibility or vulnerability to COVID in itself. So it's these areas and very high polluted areas is definitely going to increase your risk and likelihood to have COVID, and severe COVID is where we really also have to consider this relationship of having this background reduced immunity and leading to severe COVID with exposure to high air pollution.
And I imagine they can see that because you already know many areas across the world that are getting substantial pollution from whatever it may be, particularly in the developing countries. Then you overlay that with the percentage of folks getting the disease and how it affects them. So I can see where that's fact. Jason, you wanted to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I was going to say that, although we have initial evidence from these studies, there's been a lot of challenges in conducting them too, which I think we need to keep in mind. And a lot of that stems from the fact that we didn't know the etiology of COVID for a long time in the process of conducting these studies in the middle of a pandemic, where we had situations of people spending a lot of time indoors that they hadn't previously. So a lot of the assumptions that we had with respect to traditional epidemiology studies focused on ambient air pollution, we questioned a little bit because now you had stay-at-home orders. So we knew that the patterns of exposure were a little bit different. But there's definitely some indication that living in more polluted areas does increase the risk of someone potentially getting not only infection of COVID, potentially dying of COVID.
Now, Heather, back to you too. I want to ask you, are there any stats that confirm the suspicions of people like myself that asthma and our allergies are on the rise and that has something to do with air pollution?
I'm going to be honest, I am not the expert necessarily on the rise, but there is increased hospital admissions on high days of air pollution for a variety of health outcomes. And definitely lots of data suggesting that there is increased hospital admissions, increased exacerbation of diseases with high levels of air pollution.
Jason, you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, exactly what Heather said. There's lots of evidence specifically for PM2.5 and even ozone that there's a relationship between daily exposures to those pollutants and exacerbation of asthma as reflected in increases in hospital admissions and emergency department visits. And then long-term exposure to PM2.5, there is evidence of asthma development, specifically in children. But I think it's important to always go back and remember that asthma is a multi-etiologic disease, and air pollution, although there's evidence of it leading to asthma development, it's just one of many risk factors.
Now, the impact of climate change on air pollution and vice versa, the impact of air pollution on climate change. Let's start with you on that, Heather.
Yes, I would like to say it's typically the inverse. I actually say air pollution is one of the leading causes of climate change that we would say. So there's definitely a large relationship, and they're very much interconnected. And by reducing air pollution, we're going to be reducing climate change. Or by reducing climate change, you have to reduce your air pollution. So they're really one and the same. In that frame of mind as well, by reducing air pollution, you're also going to be reducing the health impacts of climate change and vice versa, because there are specific health impacts associated with climate change, such as heat stroke, et cetera, the exacerbation of allergies due to increased pollen, et cetera, increased floods leading to large amounts of dampness and mold. So by reducing air pollution, you're going to reduce that climate change, those impacts. And, of course, there's also this reduction of air pollution that's going to reduce those health impacts as well. So it's a win-win in both ways.
Really briefly, Jason, though, can you connect the dots, though, for our listeners about how air pollution, so you can take any particular pollutant, how it directly affects climate change?
That's not entirely my area of expertise, but I think one angle that's a little different than what Heather was talking about, which I totally agree with everything that Heather said, is that climate change does produce conditions that increase the frequency of wildfires. And so, you can get an increase in air pollution due to the increase in wildfire events that we're now seeing, which is directly translatable to climate issues because we're getting more instances of drought. You're getting some more instances of unique weather situations like high-frequency lightning events that we haven't seen necessarily in the past, and lightning can lead to wildfire events. And so although many wildfire individually are human-caused, you do have a frequency that are caused by lightning strikes.
Is there a pollutant that adds to greenhouse gas?
Yeah, I was just going to, it's similar to that. There's the black carbon, as we were discussing earlier, which is a very important health damaging pollutant. It's actually the strongest short-lived climate pollutant that we have. So much of actually the climate change, the experience and the changes in temperature and stuff that we're seeing today physically, is actually due to the black carbon in the atmosphere, because it's a much, much quicker impact on the environment than, for example, carbon dioxide, which takes 100 years, for example. And carbon and black carbon, we can see in just a couple of weeks this increase in temperatures and things. And it increases and it has massive impacts on health. So by reducing black carbon, this fine particulate matter, we're going to be reducing this near-term climate change impacts as well as protecting our health.
We just have 1 minute to go before we have to close out. Briefly, starting with Jason, what can ordinary people do in their everyday lives to help drive solutions?
Sure. I mean, it's really challenging with air pollution because I think a lot of it becomes individual people taking actions, which is challenging because we're talking about emissions from a whole bunch of sources and whatnot. But I think individually things that people can do is take stock of the air quality outside. Look at, as I mentioned earlier, look at airnow.gov, get a sense, what's the air quality index today? Should I plan my day differently if I have an underlying health condition to try and prevent an exacerbation? Are there actions I can take to reduce my exposures on poor air quality days? So I think those are individual actions that people can take.
Indeed. Thank you. And Heather, you've got a few seconds. What can ordinary people do?
Just to complement that, a little level, we need to, he mentioned that it happens by a lot of sources that are outside of our control. So you need to be active. You need to call your congressman. You need to vote. You need to really be pushing to make sure that we keep regulations in there to control the pollution that's impacting our health and the health of our environment.
Thank you all so much. You really have made us smarter, and I think you've made a great impact on getting us sensitized to this. We've been with Heather Adair, Rohani with the World Health Organization, and Jason Sachs with the Environmental Protection Agency. Thank you all. And thank you all for listening in today, listeners, to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. The conversation starts here, but our goal is for it to continue in your home, in your social circles, your workplaces, at the water cooler, and in the grocery checkout line, so that we can all work together to realize that healthy living is simply not possible without a healthy planet. This is your host, Bernice Butler, and we appreciate you being with us today, and we want you to remember that our culture is a result of 1 trillion tiny acts taken by billions of people every day like yourselves. And each of those tiny acts can seem insignificant, but all of them add up one way or the other to the change we each live through. Please listen in again next week as we continue our conversation on air quality and transportation. Thank you.